Has Jesus Christ, God Himself, the Creator of the universe, descended into our world and changed bread into His living human heart in the Eucharistic miracle of Buenos Aires? If this is true, it will create a turning point in the history of humanity. In my talk that follows, I present the scientific evidence for belief. The story I'm going to talk about has been universally known as the Eucharistic miracle of Buenos Aires. It was in 1996 that a communion host was found in a parish church in Argentina, and it was picked up by the priest, but it had been abandoned. The priest put it into a bowl of water, put it in the tabernacle. Then after a matter of days, the host appear to bleed and transform into another substance which looked like flesh and blood. The prevailing bishop at the time was the current Pope Francis, and he wanted to investigate it. And I was fortunate to have been involved centrally in that investigation. The results of that investigation, I believe, will have important ramifications for the Church, for religion, and for humanity. We know that people find it difficult to believe that miracles can happen. We live in an era influenced very much by the Enlightenment, which says that miracles don't happen. There's always a natural explanation for things that we can't explain. It's only going to be a matter of time when science can find out answers to these questions we can't follow, can't understand. But in this case, I was given the opportunity to witness events myself, to film them, to interview the people involved in the investigation, and particularly to document it in a way that a person trying to follow the story can look over my shoulder to see the extent to which attempts were made to try and disprove possibilities that it's afford, and that certainly had potential to be what it's claimed to be. But in the past, there have been Eucharistic miracles in the Church, and it's strange that we never hear about them. I've gone through my Catholic school education, and even in latter years, never heard that there were claims of Eucharistic miracles in the Church. And I thought, if they were real, why would they be front page news? Why would the Church not want to promote these as means to understand the Eucharist? Why would God permit this to happen without having a meaning? Is it something you just ignore because it's too hard to deal with? So when this opportunity came up, I knew that I would have to treat this case much like a lawyer who had to sift through the evidence and try and be able to present it in a way that you could ensure that from the time of taking of the sample to the examination of the material, there was no possibility of fraud, intervention or manipulation. And so these were the priests that we interviewed firstly in the Eucharistic miracle of the Buenos Aires story. We separated them, we put them into, we brought them in and interviewed them in much the same way as you would interview in a court scene, where you don't allow the person, the next witness, to hear the previous witness's statement. So we documented what each of them said. We were able to assess their credibility, assess their disposition, cross-examine about some of their claims, and then put together what we can understand the scenes have been before we arrived, when we arrived in October 1999 to commence the examination. The Eucharistic miracle of Buenos Aires was documented in the early stage of its happening, and there you see on the screen one of the earliest depictions of the transformation that occurred within the first week of the host being put into the bowl of water. And there it is a matter of a few weeks later, and you can see an incredible transformation that happened. And the good thing about those involved with this at the church at the time is they took very good photographs of what was happening. So you could see the original host, you could see how it was breaking down, you could form an opinion easily that it wasn't something that the host had been taken out and then something else put in, because the progressive stages of the photographs show the breaking down of the host, which was always present in the bowl. And so there you see the succession of seeing, as we took the sample, and documented each phase of it being removed from where it was when we first saw it, ultimately to being put into a container where we then produced it to the various scientists who were asked to examine it. And here you see a line of scientists that I used initially to try and interpret the pathology of what was in that particular sample. And what was interesting was that I interviewed about at least six forensic people who looked at this sample and were somewhat confused by it in its interpretation. And there was a reason why it was confusing to them, because the sample was one that could only be read and fully understood by someone who had expertise in forensics and in cardiology. And I'm going to bring you to part of the documentary I made on this, where we actually bring the sample to that particular scientist, and he's the key person to the understanding of what had happened. And it's quite a nice piece, because I actually filmed the person taking the sample, looking at it under the microscope, and him telling us, as he's looking, what it is. And you become a person in the room in what I believe is an historic piece of footage.
It was here, in Buenos Aires, that something most extraordinary happened. Pope Francis, then the Archbishop of the city, wanted it investigated, and I was privileged to have carried out that investigation. It revealed far more than I ever expected. It is that story which is the centrepiece of my book. It has now become universally known as the Eucharistic miracle of Buenos Aires. It happened in this church. The story centred around this priest, Padre Alexandro Pizzet, who said that on the 18th of August in 1996, a communion host was found abandoned in his church. The host was put into a bowl of water and then locked in the tabernacle. 8 days later, when the tabernacle was opened, a blood-like substance was noticed coming from the host. In the following week, the transformation continued. In October of 1999, samples were taken, and then the investigation began. In 2004, I presented a sample to New York forensic pathologist Dr. Frederick Zugibe. He was told nothing of its origin. He had no trouble identifying the substance.
Heart tissue. There's a inflammatory infiltrate here. The heart tissue itself is degenerating. Is degenerative. In other words, this is what happens sometimes after a heart attack. This is a person that had a heart attack, but it's not immediate. In other words, the person had to have lived a period of time after this. Now, there's other things that can cause this type of a item that resembles a heart attack. In automobile accidents, where they get chest crushes and it causes damage to the heart. You get it from a person getting beat up across the chest. You get coronary injuries from that. You get coronary injuries from people who gave CPR incorrectly, and a person comes out of it. That area may die off. The injury hit this area of the heart, right here. The heart is one area that I know. Yep. This is my business. I think it actually comes from about right in this area, right in here.
And what's the function of that part of the heart?
That's the left ventricle. That's a major area that pumps the blood to all parts of the body. Now, what's the history?
Okay. We're investigating the potential of this being a Eucharistic miracle. A communion host was found abandoned in a church in Argentina in 1996. Somebody picked it up and instead of a priest consuming it, because it had been on the floor and was dirty, they placed it in water. It was put in the tabernacle. When it was taken out a few days later, there was a blood-like substance. Then when the blood-like substance appeared, they thought something is happening here, so they put it all into distilled water.
That is amazing. How long had it been in the water in all?
3 years.
That tissue was in water for 3 years?
Yes.
That's hard to believe, because the tissue in here shows good fixation. And it would be amazing. The big thing about it is, that's really so funny, here it's heart muscle, but those cells are not normally there. Those inflammatory cells are not normally there. They come in as a reaction to injury. The blood supply is compromised and so forth. That's what really amazes me, that if that was a piece of Eucharist, where did those cells come from? These cells have to come from other areas of the body in order to do that. You guys are kind of like detectives on this stuff, huh?
I think it's the world's biggest detective story.
Uh-huh.
Indeed, the biggest detective story in the world. As a lawyer, I had engaged Dr. Zugibe to examine the Buenos Aires sample I gave him. There was just journalist Mike Willesee and myself in the room. It was then I filmed Dr. Zugibe tell, for the first and only time ever, his most astonishing findings. It was an historic moment. What I recorded him say has already reverberated around the world, and it will continue to do so forever. The telltale signs of injury were the presence of living white blood cells. Forensic pathologist Dr. Robert Lawrence commented on the presence of those cells.
If this material had been placed directly into water after it was taken off a body, I would expect these cells to be dissolved. So they were active, living white cells at the time they were collected.
The spontaneous coming into existence from nothing of those living white blood cells is astonishing. Cells are the basic units of life. They are evidence of life. The cell is the most complex and mystifying item ever encountered in the study of biology. Each tiny cell has been likened to a functioning city, and yet all those you see on this screen could fit on the tip of a pin. It takes this university student textbook of over 1,000 pages to attempt to explain the cell. Something of the complexity of the cell is seen in this chart of its biochemical pathways. The cell has been likened to a tiny factory with thousands of beautifully designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery, far more complicated than any machinery built by man, and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. The rules of biology say that cells can only ever come from other existing cells. But the question remains, where did the first cell come from, and how did it get to be so complex and contain such obvious evidence of magnificent design, engineering, logic, and purpose? Science tells us that what you see here was not designed at all, because the forces of nature can and did self-assemble that first cell over billions of years. This is a theory based on assumptions and not on facts. But the facts in the Buenos Aires case tell us something very different. This snapshot of what was seen under the microscope is direct evidence of human cells and human life having come into existence from non-living matter spontaneously and not over billions of years. Here we clearly see the living white blood cells that Dr. Zugibe spoke about. And then, on the right, the human heart muscle tissue itself, all from a living person. For over 100 years, scientists have been experimenting and searching for how life began, and they still don't know. They have been looking for one instance of where a cell of life has emerged from non-living matter, and they have not found one. Scientists can now end their 100-year search. In the Buenos Aires case, they will find what they have been looking for. And the same with the human heart tissue. This tissue is from one of the most complex organs of the human body, and it came into existence spontaneously, without evolution and without ancestry. But science tells us with insistence that the human heart only exists today because it's self-assembled through a Darwinian evolutionary process over billions of years from a series of lesser forms of species. Darwin himself said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. On his own test, Darwin's theory has now absolutely broken down. The Buenos Aires case puts God finally back into the creation story.
Dealing with the first part first, the section on its relevance to the church. When I was interviewing Dr. Zugibe, you remember how he says, I'm a heart specialist, the heart is my business. And then he looks at looks at his microscope and he says, this is flesh, this is heart. This is the part of the tissue of the heart near the left ventricle wall, close to a valvular area. This is the heart muscle that gives the heart its beat and the body its life. He says, but this tissue is infiltrated with white blood cells. They come in to address trauma and injury. What I'm seeing here is that this person has suffered traumatic injuries as a result of the blood supply to his heart being compromised. And then he goes on to say, it's not dissimilar to what I've seen in cases where someone has been severely beaten over the chest in the region of the heart. And can you imagine how Mike Willis and I felt sitting there, watching this man looking down the microscope, who knows nothing of its origin, giving us an account. What we understand was what happened to Christ during his passion and crucifixion. He certainly knew nothing about it. When I first engaged him, I had difficulty trying to come up with a way of not telling him anything about the source of it, so that he could do it on a blind test and not be influenced by anything. So when I wrote to him, I said, and this is stretching the truth a little bit, I'm a lawyer working on a case. It's important for me to try and determine the identity of some material on a microscopic slide. It's a sensitive case. I'll tell you all about it after you've looked at it. And so we took it on that basis. Mike Willis and I then flew from Australia to New York, and then by train 2 hours north to upstate New York, to interview this man for 2 hours, and then flew back all the way to Australia. But what we got from him in that interview was well worth our effort. This man knew nothing about it, and he was able to give us that precise identification of the material. But he even went further. He said, this snapshot of the heart that I'm looking at is a snapshot of a living person, not a dead person. And he says that because the white blood cells can only come from a living body. And he said that, and then he went on to say something else which was really remarkable. He says, I can give you a date, I can give you a time when the compromising of the blood supply occurred to that person. He says, I'm looking at a person who's living, his heart's alive, but by the way in which the white blood cells are configured, by the way in which the tissue has fragmented, that particular arrangement of blood cells, tissue formation, balance of heart, enables me, from a programmed way of studying compromising of the heart, to tell you that this incident took place 3 days before the event that we're now looking at, a living heart. And then that confused me a bit, because where does the 3 days come in? We know that Jesus was scourged on the Friday. He died on the morning of the Friday. He died on the Friday, and then I can't see the relevance of the 3 days. I then went and asked a theologian about it, and he said, well, one way of explaining this might be that we understand the communion, the Eucharist, to be a representation of Jesus, of his passion, death and resurrection. And that when we receive communion, we are receiving Jesus alive as at the moment of the resurrection, having suffered the passion. But gee, that's amazing. Why do we ever hear that? This has this incredible quality, this our understanding of the Eucharist. And then if you speak to, or you look at the Catholics' understanding of the Eucharist, they say, yes, the communion, at communion time, the time of consecration, the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ, becomes truly present. But I think that what will happen following the theologians' analysis of what's happened here, they may be able to come up with a little refinement to that, to talk more in terms of not only does Jesus, is he giving us his body and blood, but he's there present. He's present, having suffered, alive, and he brings to us his heart, his physical heart, as part of what we receive in communion. And it makes you think, when you hear all this, how when you walk up to communion and you think about what you're about to receive, in view of what I've just told you, you can think this way: I'm going to receive Jesus. Who is that Jesus? He's the creator of the universe. He's your creator. He's the one who will stand in judgment on your death to determine whether you are eligible to enter his kingdom. If he determines that you are, he will bring you into his kingdom and treat you as royalty in a paradise that lasts forever. And yet this King, this Jesus, humbles himself to come to you in the form of the way he's devised to be with you till the end of time in the communion, anxious to place his heart on your heart as a foretaste of being in heaven. That thought process has changed my approach to communion, and I'm sure when you think about it, it'll do the same for you. We often hear of priests and others trying to work out ways of increasing that 7% that Father talked about that only come to Mass. And what happens to the other 93%? Why aren't they interested in coming? So we come up with ideas of, let's make the church, the Mass more enjoyable. Let's be more welcoming. Let's have good music for the children when they come in. Make it Mass more child friendly. Maybe they're good things, but just could you imagine how different it might be if that other 93% were told of what I've just told you, that Jesus is truly present, as if he's standing there in front of you, wanting to share an intimate moment with you by giving to you his heart in the Eucharist, which he has demonstrated in these Eucharistic miracles, that is present, and that you can converse with him in a way that you've never thought of before. With that type of narrative, that sort of introduction to the Eucharist, you wouldn't need to worry about welcoming committees or fancy music. There'll be traffic jams of people coming to Mass. And perhaps that may well happen following a full analysis of the consequences of the story. The other side of the story is what I see as the impact it will have on society and religion generally, and particularly science. Mike Willesee, who worked with me on this story, summed up the case very nicely with this quote. He said, with this statement, he said, when a communion host, which is bread, bleeds and transforms into the living, traumatised heart of a human being, is more than just a wow moment. It's a traumatic day for science. Why is it traumatic? Is because for the first time ever known, life has come into being from inert matter. And you think that through. There's no other case in history, if anyone can ever find one, tell me, where there's been scientific evidence of life coming into being from non-living matter, from where there was no life before. The piece in the documentary section I showed you talked about the intricacy of the cell and how complex that cell is. The particular cells that you identify, any cell rather, is regarded as evidence of life. It's not only evidence of life. It's a sign of life. It's evidence of life, and we can deem that as being a cell that's comprised of all that intricacy that you saw in that fancy design pattern on the screen in the documentary. I showed you what the scientists have been able to identify in the cell as the biochemical pathways. They are I suppose it's the brain, it's the computer program for how your body works. And it's interesting that the cells that we saw working to address the trauma and the injury of the heart were working in accordance with the pattern of the metabolical pathways that you see somewhere in there. It's all part of the full body of information that goes together to determine how you live, how you reproduce, how your immune system works. All that's caught up in that cell form, in that program, in that diagram. But as we know, and I've explained there, that these cells came into existence spontaneously. They came into existence from nothing in the context of God, a Catholic Mass. But you look at the science books and say, oh no, those cells couldn't possibly come that way. The metabolical pathway that you see there on that earlier screen had a time process for which we can identify or imagine, and it follows this. It took 4.5 billion years for that to self-assemble and come to form a cell. And that's what the scientific textbooks tell you about the cell. That's what you all learn at university. That's what is promoted around as being the origin of life. Now we have new information. We have information that demonstrates that couldn't be right. I put these arguments together in a book that I wrote not too long ago, 2013, The Unseen, New Evidence, Origin of Life under the Microscope. And I sent the book to the forensic pathologist who worked with me on the case. And after he read it, he wrote back this to me.
Ron, it will make us scientists rethink all our concepts. I am not religious. The book contains a convincing argument in favour of a creative agency and makes Darwinian evolution an inadequate explanation of how the world and its inhabitants came to be.
We probably well know that in the last few decades there's been a decline in belief in God. Much of this has to do with the predominance of evolutionary theory as an explanation for our existence, for the origin of life and the evolution of life. And it's almost taken roots that are impossible to remove. And so when a child goes into a classroom at school, goes to the religion class, he's got a bit of a dilemma, because the religion teachers tell you that God made the world, God made you, He made you in His image, you have an eternal destiny. Then he goes into the science class and he says, well, you're backward thinking, believing in God, because our famous Oxford professor, Richard Dawkins, said, God is a delusion. We have other ways of explaining our existence other than God. We have evolutionary theory. And of course, they say to us, you know, your beliefs are based upon myth and superstition. You're not welcome in a science class because you can't bring anything forward to demonstrate any scientific basis for your belief. But now science has come to our aid. Science is on our side. It's saying there is a scientific basis for our belief. Just imagine that. we not only have reason to believe, but we have evidence to believe in what we believe. So no longer should we be denied entry into the science class because we have no scientific basis for our belief in the essential principles of the Catholic faith or in the belief in God. We are now, I believe, have a place there to be able to defend it. One of the important factors for supporting a claim for a scientific argument is to have replication. Not only do we have this story coming out in a very strong scientific way in the results of the Buenos Aires case, but there have been a number of other Eucharistic miracles that have been scientifically examined in the following years, which I've followed up, and I'll just give you a brief run on because they are important to have been able to say, well, you may have claimed that you've got a scientific basis for your belief in God from that case, but that could be just an aberration. It's, in science we need more than just one case. Well, have a look at this. We've got the Buenos Aires case. In Lanciano in Italy in the 8th century, the famous case where the transformation, when examined back in 1971, turned out to be human heart tissue. We have in Mexico in October 2006, communion host led in the chalice, examined and found after a series of tests to have also been heart tissue. In Sokolka, Poland, 2008, again a host had fallen to the floor, was picked up, put into water, began to bleed, and then two scientists from one of the universities in Poland examined it. We interviewed them, and they said the substance was entirely heart muscle tissue of human origin. It was from a living person that suffered severe trauma. Then in Legnica, Poland, on the 12th of October 2018, another instance where a host had fallen to the floor, placed in water, bled, scientifically examined, and it was heart muscle tissue showing evidence of suffering. And those scenes you see there of the microscopic slides are the sections that they make that determination from. But what's interesting about the Buenos Aires case is that there's far more information in that case than in the other cases, and that's how I'm able to draw some of these additional conclusions from that story. So if you look at the list, you've got all of those cases where there's been transformation and the resultant substance is heart tissue. I want to bring you to this particular shot. I come back to this because it's the shot that it's the depiction of heart that the scientist looked at and said this is a living person, suffered trauma, and was able to follow through examining every little detail on that slide to give us the information that exudes from it. When I was looking at this, I thought, only a week ago, I thought, this is quite an amazing piece of information. It's almost like God has drafted on the canvas a story written in the language of science. It has a parallel to the story of the Ten Commandments. When God first gave Moses the commandments with his finger, inscribing into stone the Ten Commandments. It was to show his power, his authority, that he wanted us to understand and interpret and to follow the magnitude of what he was writing. I see that happening in this particular scene here, because it's directed, the language isn't a code that can be read only by scientists. And remember, scientists in the past, in the recent past, have not been so keen to acknowledge God. But God has put into their hands and into their responsibility the role of having to interpret something which is to confirm many of the things that it has denied. First of all, it's in code to say, I am alive, I am the creator of life, I came to earth and was crucified and beaten. I rose from the dead. I left my church, the Eucharist, in which I placed my heart. All of these are things that a scientist can easily read from that information. It's almost like God had written this code for the scientists to tell the church and humanity, because we believe in the value of science, and the science can't deny what they're reading here. And that's where I see the value in this, and it will sit as an icon in history, like the Ten Commandments, in terms of explaining what we believe and what science has revealed about God God, His presence, His ability to create life, and being present in the Eucharist. But there's one other little benefit that comes from all of this that we probably haven't thought about, and that is it also gives to the Protestant brothers a basis for trying to accept what we believe and have always maintained, that transubstantiation did happen, and that it's happened here, telling us through science, and perhaps you should know about it too. And I have a nice story that follows on from that in this scene here. Okay, you probably know the person on the right, well, very well known. The lesser well known person is the person on her left, Gavin Ashenden. He was the spiritual advisor or chaplain to Queen Elizabeth for many years. But a couple of years ago he decided to give it all up and become a Catholic. And one of the reasons why he did was my work on this Eucharistic miracle of Buenos Aires. In a newspaper item, after he announced his decision to leave the Protestants and become a Catholic, was, I think the Protestants have had it wrong since the time of the Reformation. These cases demonstrate that transubstantiation is for real, and that we have been wrong in denying Catholic understanding of the Mass and the Eucharist. And that was quite a strong statement. But it was also to enhance that statement during an interview he had with John Henry Weston of Lifesite News last year. And here is a transcript of what he said on that program.
When I came across the Eucharistic miracles, and particularly the work that Ron Tesoriero has done, I was just astonished. If Ron was right, and if all of the evidence of what happened in the Buenos Aires miracle is right, then this says that transubstantiation really happened. One of the things that I have not been able to understand ever since is why the rest of the world isn't very, very excited about this, because it is beyond contesting. For years, Christians have been complaining that rationalists and pluralists have been on our backs giving us a hard time. Suddenly empiricism comes to our aid. Why are we not saying, pay attention?
It's timely that we recognise that God has stepped into our world in a very significant way at a time when we can see around us Christianity very much under attack. We know that some of the parliaments of Australia have decided to abandon their Christian heritage and remove the Our Father from the beginning of Parliament. It was even attempted here in Canberra. But you can sense the feeling behind this, because they think that it's politically advantageous to remove Christ from the equation. But I think with these stories, we can have the courage to go forward and say he should be placed back where he was, as the centre of our Parliament, the centre of our world. And I think as these stories permeate through society, that will begin to happen.